Welcome to today's deep dive. Usually when we talk about legal systems or like building a civilization from the ground up, there's this underlying expectation of, I don't know, mathematical precision.
Right, like it's a hard science.
Exactly. We treat it like civil engineering.
Mm.
You draw up this brilliant blueprint for a utopian city, you lay a flawless foundation, you put up the walls, and you just expect the people living inside to naturally conform to the geometry of the building.
Yeah, you expect them to just, walk in straight lines.
Which is a beautiful idea in theory, right?
Hmm.
It's binary, clean lines. An action is either legal or illegal, right or wrong, broken or intact. It really appeals to our desire for order.
Oh, absolutely. We find tremendous comfort in that.
We really do. We want morality and legality to be perfectly categorized so we know exactly where we stand at any given moment. But the second you introduce actual living, breathing, severely flawed human beings into that perfect geometrical city,
The blueprint just completely falls apart.
it really does, because human reality is inherently messy. People are driven by the need to survive, by commerce, by sudden desires, weird necessities, and of course, enormous egos.
And that tension is exactly what we are exploring today. We're
Yeah.
looking at an ancient system that attempted this incredibly difficult balancing act.
Yeah, and it's a huge balancing act.
On one hand, you have a society aspiring to the absolute highest, most rigid divine ideals imaginable. But on the other hand, that same society still has to function on a Tuesday afternoon when someone, needs to buy groceries.
Or it gets invited to a highly awkward dinner party.
Right. Or experiences a bizarre medical emergency.
So to get to the bottom of how you engineer that balance, we are pulling from a really fascinating historical source today. We're exploring translated excerpts from a classical Islamic jurisprudential text. Specifically, we're diving into a section known as the Book of Disliked Matters, or in Arabic, Kitab al-Karaha.
And we should probably clarify our approach here just right off the bat.
Yeah, good point.
Because delving into centuries-old religious jurisprudence can sometimes carry, a lot of modern baggage. We're not here to debate modern politics, and we certainly aren't taking theological sides or endorsing specific rulings.
No, not at all. We are strictly treating this text as a masterful piece of historical social engineering. We're unpacking the highly structured legal philosophy of the Hanafi school of thought and, well, exactly how they attempted to solve the puzzle of human behavior.
Right, we're looking at the mechanics of it.
Exactly. And what I found so compelling about this source material is the sheer granularity of it. I mean, we are going to look at their rulings on everything from the specific metallurgical makeup of the plates you eat off of to the ethics of ancient market monopolies.
Even what might be the earliest recorded legal debates over reconstructive plastic surgery.
Yes, the plastic surgery part is wild. But before we get to the gold noses and the ancient bazaars, we really have to start with the title of the book itself, the Book of Disliked Matters.
Yeah, it's a very specific phrase.
When I normally think of religious law, especially Islamic law, I tend to think of two very distinct buckets, right? Halal, the permitted, and haram, the absolutely forbidden. But this entire text is built around a gray area.
Right, the concept of makruh.
Yeah, makruh, which translates to disliked. So what kind of legal weight does a word like disliked actually carry?
That is the pivotal question, honestly. And the scholars who founded this school of thought debated that exact semantic issue right at the beginning of the text. Because in any robust legal system, the binary of permitted and forbidden just isn't enough to capture human experience.
Because life happens almost entirely in the gray area.
Exactly. So makruh is the category they developed for actions that are strongly discouraged, behaviors that kind of pollute the social or spiritual environment, but perhaps lack the incontrovertible divine condemnation required to throw someone in the absolutely forbidden bucket.
Right, and the source outlines a really intense disagreement between the founding figures of the school over what that gray area actually means in practice. You have a scholar named Muhammad taking a very hardline stance.
And then you have two absolute heavyweights of the tradition, Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, taking a much more nuanced view.
So break down Muhammad's argument for us. Why was he so hardline?
Well, Muhammad's argument was essentially an epistemological one. It was about the philosophy of evidence. He basically argued that every single thing categorized as makruh is, in reality, completely forbidden. It is haram.
Wait, so if it's haram, why call it disliked?
Because the jurists do not possess a mathematically absolute, unambiguous textual proof. like a direct, unassailable quote from the Quran, so they simply don't have the theological authority to apply the ultimate label of haram.
Ah.
They call it disliked out of a profound fear of putting words in God's mouth. But in practice, Muhammad wanted people to treat these actions as strictly forbidden.
So for him, it's purely a technicality regarding the burden of proof. The action is still a crime, they just can't legally call it a capital offense because the evidentiary paperwork isn't perfect.
That captures his stance perfectly.
Yeah.
But Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf pushed back on that pretty hard. They argued that makruh isn't just a placeholder label for forbidden things with weak evidence.
Right, they saw it differently.
They viewed it as a genuinely distinct category on a moral spectrum. They defined it as something that is closer to haram. It brings a person dangerously close to the boundary of sin, it degrades their character, but crossing into the makruh territory is not technically the same as leaping over the cliff into absolute prohibition.
So why does this foundational debate matter so much for the rest of the rules we're going to look at today? I mean, it kind of feels like we were just parsing the definitions of ancient vocabulary here.
It matters because it establishes the psychological operating system of this entire legal framework. It shows us a group of jurists who are obsessively, meticulously concerned with precision and the limits of their own authority.
Like they don't want to overstep.
Exactly. If they're going to restrict the daily behaviors of millions of people, they demand exactness. They absolutely refuse to throw around the concept of absolute prohibition lightly.
That makes a lot of sense.
When they step in to govern the chaotic reality of human life, they want to operate with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, carefully separating the genuinely destructive behaviors from the merely distasteful ones.
The surgeon's scalpel. That concept is going to come up again and again today, because the very first place they apply that scalpel in this text is to the most mundane, fundamental human necessity imaginable.
Sitting down to eat a meal.
Yes. The text opens with a very stark, unambiguous prohibition regarding the dinner table. It rules that it is completely impermissible for men or women to eat, drink, apply oils, or use perfume from vessels made of gold and silver.
And the language they use to justify this ban is remarkably vivid. They cite a prophetic tradition stating that whoever drinks from a gold or silver vessel is essentially gulping the fire of hell into their belly.
Wow, that is not a gentle discouragement.
No, it's an aggressive, visceral warning against using specific types of tableware.
It is an incredibly aggressive image, but when you look at the historical context of the 8th century, when this school of thought was really flourishing, you're dealing with the Abbasid Caliphate.
Right, the Golden Age.
Yeah. You have immense, staggering wealth pouring into cities like Baghdad and Kufa. You have a society that started with very humble, austere desert origins, suddenly colliding with the remnants of Byzantine and Sasanian imperial luxury.
It was a massive cultural shift.
Exactly. And the text explicitly tells us the rationale behind the ban. It says using gold and silver is imitating the customs of polytheistic emperors, and it constitutes an arrogant display of extravagance.
Right. It operates as a sumptuary law. The primary goal is to flatten the visual and material hierarchy of the society.
Just level the playing field.
Exactly. Think about the basic nature of eating. It's the great equalizer, right? Every human being, from the caliph to the poorest laborer, must eat to survive. By banning the ultimate status symbols, gold and silver plates, from this universal daily routine, the law actively prevents the ultra-wealthy from weaponizing their wealth at the dinner table.
It stops them from constantly flaunting their dominance over the poor during the most basic act of human survival.
Precisely.
Which makes total sense as an ancient wealth equality measure. But this is where the text introduces a fascinating wrinkle that I really want to pull apart.
Okay, let's hear it.
Right after this incredibly strict ban on gold and silver, the text casually notes that there is absolutely no harm in using vessels made of lead, glass, crystal, and agate.
Yes, the crystal exception.
Now, I don't know about 8th century market prices, but crystal and agate are not cheap materials. A masterfully carved crystal goblet could easily be more expensive and certainly more beautiful than a plain silver cup.
You are hitting on the exact counter-argument that was raised by rival scholars at the time. The text actually documents a debate with another famous jurist, Al-Shafi'i.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he looked at that exact loophole and argued that if the fundamental principle is to prevent wealthy people from showing off, then crystal and glass should absolutely be banned too.
I mean, his logic makes sense.
Right, because practically speaking, a wealthy merchant is going to use a massive crystal bowl to boast and elevate himself above his guests, just as effectively as he would with a silver bowl.
Al-Shafi'i's logic seems completely airtight. If the disease is arrogance, ban all the tools of arrogance. Why did the Hanafis defend the use of crystal?
Their defense is a brilliant piece of sociological pragmatism. The Hanafis responded by saying that the law cannot police every single beautiful or expensive item in existence.
It would be impossible.
Exactly.
Right.
Instead, the law must target the specific, universally recognized cultural currency of arrogance. In their specific historical and cultural context, gold and silver were the undeniable universal markers of obnoxious excess.
Oh, I see.
Crystal and glass, while potentially expensive, did not carry that same toxic, instantly recognizable social signaling.
That is such a nuanced way to view the law. It really reminds me of the modern phenomenon of stealth wealth.
Oh, yeah, that's a great comparison.
Right. You have billionaires today walking around Silicon Valley in plain, unbranded gray T-shirts or simple cashmere sweaters that secretly cost $4,000.
But they don't look flashy.
Exactly. They aren't walking around wearing giant diamond-encrusted gold chains with luxury logos all over them because the cultural currency of boasting has shifted. The Hanafi scholars are essentially saying, we are only going to legislate against the giant diamond-encrusted gold chains of our era.
We're legislating against the obvious toxic social signal, not the mere existence of expensive things.
It's so smart.
They're regulating the undeniable symbol of excess. It shows an understanding that law must be deeply tied to the specific cultural context of the society it governs, rather than chasing every possible iteration of wealth.
But speaking of chasing iterations of wealth, I have to bring up what feels like the ultimate, most hypocritical loophole in this entire section.
I think I know where you're going with this.
The text poses a hypothetical. What if a very wealthy man knows he cannot drink from a solid silver cup? So he takes a wooden cup and he plates the entire outside with silver.
Or he has a wooden chair, and he covers it in silver plating.
Yes. The text gives Abu Hanifa's personal ruling on this, and it honestly made me laugh out loud because it is so hyper-technical.
It is incredibly specific.
Yeah.
Abu Hanifa rules that drinking from a silver-plated vessel, or sitting on a silver-plated chair, is technically permissible, provided the user physically avoids touching the specific place where the silver is located.
Wait, so if I have a cup and the rim is silver but the side of the cup is wood, I am legally in the clear as long as my lips only touch the wood.
According to him, yes.
I can sit in the dining room looking at my beautiful silver-plated cup, projecting all that wealth to my guests, and as long as my skin doesn't physically contact the metal, I haven't broken the law.
Technically speaking, no.
That feels like the kind of technicality a wealthy merchant would pay a modern lawyer a lot of money to come up with.
It absolutely sounds like a modern tax loophole.
Mm-hmm.
But we really have to look at the jurisprudential philosophy driving it.
Okay, what's the philosophy?
Abu Hanifa was a strict literalist in many aspects of transaction and material law. He argued that the divine prohibition applies to the literal, physical utilization of the forbidden material. If your skin or your lips do not physically contact the silver, you are not legally using the silver in the prohibited sense.
So proximity isn't usage.
Right. He categorized the silver plating as a subordinate element of the cup, not the primary material of use. It's an incredibly mechanical view of the law.
Did anyone push back on him? Because it feels like that completely defeats the whole don't show off your wealth principle we just talked about.
Oh, absolutely. His own leading student, Abu Yusuf, strongly disagreed with him.
I'm not surprised.
Abu Yusuf argued that using a part of a vessel is inherently using the whole vessel. He took a holistic view of the action. He said if you bring a silver-plated cup to your face, you are participating in the culture of extravagance, and the physical location of your lips is irrelevant to the moral reality of the situation.
It is a clash of two fundamentally different legal minds. Abu Yusuf is basically performing a vibe check.
A vibe check. I like that.
He is. He's looking at the holistic intent and the social impact of the action. Abu Hanifa is looking at the absolute literal mechanics. If the skin does not bridge the gap to the silver, the circuit of the law is not completed. It is just fascinating.
It really is.
And this tension between strict mechanical rules and the messy reality of human interaction becomes even more pronounced when we leave the dining room and step out into the city streets.
Because the market changes everything.
Exactly. Because if the laws governing what you eat from require this much microscopic debate, the laws governing the people you buy that food from are a whole different beast.
This transition from the private home to the public square brings us to one of the most brilliant structural distinctions in classical Islamic thought.
Let's get into it.
It's the strict division between the realm of religious affairs, which they call diyanat, and the realm of everyday worldly transactions, known as muamalat.
To really understand how this works, I think we need to picture the reality of an ancient marketplace. Imagine the bazaars of Kufa or Baghdad. These were massive, cosmopolitan melting pots.
Oh, totally chaotic.
You had Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, locals, and foreigners all crammed together, buying, selling, and trading every hour of the day. And the text provides a very common scenario. You send your servant to the market to buy meat for dinner.
Right, and the text specifically notes that your servant might be of a different faith, like a Zoroastrian.
Exactly. The servant returns with the meat and says, I bought this from a Jewish butcher, or I bought this from a Christian.
So the legal question is, can you trust the word of this servant? And can you legally consume that meat based solely on their unverified claim?
And what's the ruling?
The ruling the Hanafis establish is, yes, it's perfectly acceptable. In the realm of business and transactions, the word of a single person is accepted, regardless of their background, their faith, or even their moral character.
The text actually pushes this to an extreme that I found genuinely surprising. It says that in matters of buying, selling, and receiving gifts, the law accepts the word of a child, a slave, a non-Muslim, or a fasiq.
Which translates to a known public sinner.
Right. A guy who is notoriously corrupt in his personal life can sell you a loaf of bread, and his word that the transaction is valid is legally binding. Why would a religious legal system lower its standards of trust so drastically?
They explicitly cite the concept of haraj, which means severe hardship or overarching difficulty. The jurists realized that if they demanded the same standard of evidence for buying a loaf of bread as they did for complex religious rituals, society would simply collapse under the weight of its own bureaucracy.
Just imagine the friction. If you needed two deeply pious, verified, morally upright witnesses to sign an affidavit every single time you wanted to buy a bundle of carrots from your non-Muslim neighbor, trade would cease to exist.
People would starve.
Literally.
Precisely. The market cannot function on moral perfection. It functions on functional reliability and speed. The scholars recognize that trade requires frictionless trust.
Frictionless trust, I like that.
Transactions happen thousands of times a day among all types of people. By lowering the threshold of evidence in muamalat, the jurists were actively protecting the economic survival of the common people.
But the brilliance of the system is how it immediately contrasts that pragmatism with the realm of Duranat, the religious affairs. What happens when the stakes are no longer about buying carrots, but about the purity of your faith?
Well, in religious matters, the standard of evidence skyrockets. The text uses a classic example regarding ritual purity.
Like washing before prayers.
Exactly. Before a Muslim can perform their daily prayers, they must wash with pure water. If you are about to use a well and someone walks up and tells you, hey, that water isn't pure, an animal died in it, how do you react?
If we use the marketplace rules, I should just believe them and walk away.
Not in this case. The law states you only accept their word without question if that person is an adil,
Which means?
a known, just, and pious Muslim. If the person warning you is a known sinner, or someone whose moral state is entirely unknown to you, you are legally forbidden from just blindly accepting their claim.
Wait, really? So what do you do?
You must investigate the water yourself. Use your own intellect to deduce its purity, or actively seek an alternative water source.
The juxtaposition is amazing. If a known liar sells me a sandwich, I eat the sandwich. If a known liar tells me the water is dirty, I have to launch an investigation.
It highlights how differently they view the goals of these two realms.
It really does. The marketplace is about frictionless movement. Religion is about absolute spiritual certainty. You cannot allow a person of unknown moral character to dictate the terms of your relationship with the divine.
It's a highly sophisticated sociological framework. They understood that a one-size-fits-all standard of evidence destroys a society. You have to adapt the rigidity of the law to the specific domain of human activity it is attempting to regulate.
And if you think about it, we operate on this exact same binary today, even if we don't use those ancient Arabic terms.
We definitely do.
Think about how we navigate the modern internet. When I want to find a decent place to eat lunch, I go in a review app, and I will base my entire decision on a 5-star review written by an anonymous account named user456.
Right, you have no idea who they are.
I have no idea who that person is. They could be a convicted fraudster, they could be a terrible person, but I don't care about their soul. I just care about their transactional report that the turkey sandwich is good. That is modern muamalat.
That is a perfect parallel. The stakes are low, the need for speed is high, and the transaction is purely material.
But if I wake up with a strange, sharp pain in my chest, I am not going to trust an anonymous post by user 456 for medical advice.
I would hope not.
I am going to demand a doctor whose credentials have been rigorously vetted by a medical board, whose identity is verified, and whose ethical standards are legally bound. The domain shifts from lunch to life or death, which is our modern equivalent of die or not, and the standard of evidence completely transforms.
The human need to categorize trust based on context hasn't changed in 1,000 years. The Hanafi jurists just codified it into a massive legal structure.
Navigating the market is one thing because commerce has a clear goal. But social life, the relationships we maintain with our neighbors, our families, our peers, is where the friction of differing morals really gets hot.
Oh, absolutely. Social obligations are messy.
Navigating society means you will inevitably be invited into spaces where people are doing things you fundamentally disagree with. This brings us to a really compelling section of the text, the dilemma of the dinner party.
The walima, or the traditional wedding banquet. It is the ultimate test of social cohesion versus personal piety.
The text lays out a scenario that I think is universally relatable, even if the specifics have changed over time. You are invited to a major social gathering, you accept the invitation, you get dressed up, you arrive at the house, and the moment you walk through the door, you realize there is a massive party happening involving music, singing, and various forms of amusement.
Now, within the strict orthodox boundaries of this specific legal text, those forms of entertainment are classified as forbidden diversions.
Right, so you are standing in the doorway, a sin is actively occurring in the room. What is your legal and moral obligation?
If we followed the strict mathematical logic of prohibition, you would assume the law demands you turn around and flee the scene immediately to protect your own purity.
That's what I would assume.
But Abu Hanifa's ruling here is a masterclass in the messy realities of social duty. He rules that if you are just a regular everyday person, your obligation is to walk into the room, sit down, and eat your meal.
You just ignore the fact that something forbidden is happening right next to you.
You don't ignore it in your heart, but you don't let it destroy your social obligations. His reasoning is rooted deeply in the preservation of community.
How so?
Answering an invitation to a feast is considered a sunnah. It's a very strong prophetic tradition and a vital social duty that binds neighbors together. Abu Hanifa argues that you do not abandon your fundamental duty to your host simply because another guest in the room happens to be committing a sin.
So you don't blow up the social fabric over someone else's mistake.
Exactly.
The text includes a direct quote from Abu Hanifa that I absolutely love. He says, regarding this exact situation, I was tested with this once, and I was patient.
It is such a wonderfully humanizing detail.
It really is. You can vividly picture this brilliant, revered legal scholar sitting awkwardly in the corner of a loud party, politely chewing his dates and bread, while a band plays raucously in the courtyard, just internally counting the minutes until he can politely excuse himself.
It grounds the immense weight of the law in everyday reality. It acknowledges that living in a diverse society means you cannot live in a sterile, perfectly pious bubble.
You can't just hide.
Right. You cannot run away to a mountain cave every time you encounter behavior you dislike. If you have the social authority to politely ask them to stop the music, you should. But if you lack that power, you practice patience. You fulfill the right of the host who cooked the food.
However, there is a massive structural exception to this rule of patience. And this is where the text gets philosophically profound about the nature of hierarchy.
Yes, the rules shift entirely here.
The rule of sit down and eat changes entirely based on your status in the community.
The text stipulates that this patience is reserved strictly for the common person. The scenario completely flips if the person walking through the door is a mutadabi.
A role model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A recognized community leader, a renowned scholar, a person of high moral authority. If a mutadabi arrives at the banquet, sees the forbidden music or amusement, and cannot use their immense influence to halt it, they are legally forbidden from sitting down. They must turn around and leave the premises immediately.
So the law literally bifurcates based on fame and respect. The regular guy gets to enjoy the free lamb and rice, but the prominent community leader has to go home hungry. How do they justify punishing the leader?
They don't view it as a punishment. They view it as the unavoidable burden of influence.
The burden of influence.
Right. The text explains that if a highly respected leader stays at the party and sits passively amongst the forbidden activity, their mere presence acts as a powerful, implicit endorsement.
That makes sense.
The text uses striking language warning that a leader's presence in that room causes a blemish upon the religion and opens the door of disobedience for the Muslims.
It is acknowledging the raw psychological weight of celebrity.
Precisely. If the local blacksmith stays at the party, no one really cares. It doesn't change anyone's moral calculus. But if the great imam sits there while the music plays, every other guest in the room will look at him and rationalize their behavior.
They will say, well, the great scholar isn't leaving, so this must actually be perfectly fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The leader's physical body becomes a symbol that alters the moral gravity of the entire room.
This ancient ruling is diagnosing a problem we argue about constantly in modern media and politics.
Oh, all the time.
We talk endlessly about the ethics of platforming. If a famous politician goes on a controversial podcast hosted by someone with hateful views, or if a celebrity attends a party thrown by a disgraced billionaire, the intense public debate is always, does their mere presence validate the bad behavior?
Does sharing the space legitimize the harm?
Exactly. And this text from the 8th century is screaming, yes, absolutely. Leadership strips you of the luxury of being an anonymous, polite observer. Where you put your physical body matters because your body is a political and moral statement.
And the text includes a brilliant, subtle detail to emphasize this.
Oh, right.
When Abu Hanifa said, I was tested with this once and I was patient, the commentators note that this incident happened before he became the universally recognized leader of the community.
That's a crucial detail.
Once he achieved the status of the great imam, the muqaddabi, she lost the privilege of patience. He would have been required to leave. Influence is a heavy, restrictive garment.
That transition from the physical presence of a leader acting as a symbol to the literal garments people wear moves us right into the next major area of regulation.
Clothing and adornment.
Because just as your presence in a room signals intent, what you drape over your body signals intent to the world. The text dives deep into the highly specific, sometimes bizarre rules of fashion, bodily adornment, and the materials of clothing.
We return to the underlying theme of sumptuary laws controlling the display of wealth. But in the realm of clothing, we see a fascinating array of practical, hyper-specific exceptions.
Let's start with the baseline rule.
The foundational rule laid out in the text is straightforward. Men are strictly forbidden from wearing silk and gold. Women, conversely, are explicitly permitted to wear both, a distinction derived directly from prophetic traditions.
So the baseline is a zero-tolerance policy on silk for men. But as we've learned, this legal system hates a completely rigid wall. There are always doors built into the wall to accommodate reality. The first exception is what we can call the border exception.
The jurists recognize that demanding absolute, microscopic purity of materials and clothing is practically impossible and overly burdensome.
You can't police every thread.
Right. So the text decrees that a small amount of silk is pardoned for men. And because they are jurists, they don't leave small amount up to vague interpretation. They quantify it using the body. Is an amount equal to the width of 3 or 4 fingers?
So we're talking about a silk trim on the edge of a cotton tunic, or a silk embroidered border on a heavy wool cloak.
Yes. The text cites a historical report that the prophet himself wore a robe that was hemmed with silk. The jurisprudential logic here is that the law is targeting the dominance of luxury, not the absolute molecular eradication of the material.
A touch of elegance, a functional hem to prevent fraying, is perfectly fine. Wrapping your entire body in an extravagant silk cocoon is what crosses the line into arrogance.
Exactly.
But then we encounter an exception that completely blew my assumptions out of the water. It sits right at the bizarre intersection of theological law and ancient military tactics. I am talking about the war exception.
That's one is fascinating.
The text states that while men cannot wear silk in daily life, they are absolutely permitted to wear garments of pure silk and heavy brocade during times of war and battle. Why on earth would a religious law authorize luxury fashion in a brutal war zone?
It seems contradictory until you look at the grueling reality of ancient combat. The text provides 2 deeply pragmatic justifications.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is a physical reality of the material itself. Pure silk, especially thickly woven brocade, is incredibly strong and slick. The text notes that it is highly effective at repelling the strike of weapons.
Like it actually stops weapons.
A sword or an arrow might glance off thick silk rather than biting deep, and if an arrow does penetrate, silk doesn't tear and drag dirty fibers deep into the wound the way coarse cotton or wool would. It makes the arrow much easier to extract.
I never in a million years would have thought of ancient silk as a rudimentary form of Kevlar or tactical gear. It's early functional armor.
It really was. And the second justification is purely about psychological warfare.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
The text explicitly states that silk is more intimidating in the eye of the enemy due to its gleam.
The gleam, they are weaponizing the shininess of the fabric.
Exactly. Picture an army cresting a hill in the desert sun. If they are wearing dull wool, they look like a standard militia. But if the front lines are draped in shining silk and gold-threaded brocade, they catch the sun like a wall of light.
That would be terrifying.
It projects immense wealth, unshakable confidence, and overwhelming visual power. The scholars recognize that in a life-or-death struggle for the survival of the community, the moral prohibition against looking extravagant is completely suspended for the sheer, brutal necessity of winning the psychological battle.
Necessity overrides the general rule of humility.
Absolutely.
Pragmatism is astounding. Now, what about jewelry? The text addresses rings, stating that men are only permitted to wear rings made of silver. Gold is banned, obviously. But the text gets remarkably specific about banning rings made of iron, brass, or stone.
The prohibition against cheaper metals like iron and brass stems from traditions where the prophet reportedly saw men wearing them and remarked that they smelled of idols or resembled the adornments of the inhabitants of hell.
So silver is the only approved metal.
The approved material is strictly silver. However, the text adds a crucial caveat. Even a silver ring is primarily intended for judges, rulers, and authorities, people who possess a physical wax seal and actually need a ring to stamp official documents.
Oh, so it's a tool, not just jewelry.
Right. If you don't have a functional need to seal a document, the underlying suggestion is that you shouldn't be wearing a ring merely for vanity.
Which brings me to my absolute favorite anecdote in this entire stack of historical sources. It is a story that sounds so incredibly modern, yet it happened well over 1,000 years ago.
Ah, the silver nose.
Yes, it is the saga of the silver nose of Arfaja, and it is the ultimate case study in medical necessity clashing with religious prohibition.
The story of Arfaja ibn Asad. It provides a brilliant window into how these jurists handled extreme edge cases.
Okay, picture this scenario for a second. The text recounts the history of a man named Arfaja who fought in a brutal ancient conflict called the Battle of Al-Kulab. During the chaos of the fight, his nose is severely injured or perhaps entirely severed by a sword strike.
A catastrophic injury.
Right. Arfaja survives, but he is left with a horrific facial injury. So he seeks out early reconstructive surgery. He has a prosthetic nose fashioned for himself out of solid silver.
Which is, in itself, an incredible detail about the capabilities of ancient medical craftsmen.
It is amazing. But a massive medical problem quickly develops. The text uses the Arabic phrase, fa antana, which translates to, it started to stink.
Ouch.
Yeah. The silver oxidized where the surrounding tissue became severely infected, and the prosthetic began emitting a foul, rotting odor. Arfaja is suffering terribly, so he goes to the prophet, explains the medical disaster occurring on his face, and the prophet explicitly commands him to remove the rotting silver and have a new prosthetic nose made out of pure gold.
The medical logic is incredibly sound. Gold is a noble metal. It does not tarnish, it is highly non-reactive, and it wouldn't cause the same toxic oxidation or foul odor when constantly exposed to the moisture and breath of the human face.
In this specific scenario, gold was the vastly superior necessary medical material. It is a phenomenal story, but here is the jurisprudential problem. The Hanafi scholars have just spent pages unequivocally declaring that gold is absolutely, strictly forbidden for men to wear. So how do they interpret this glaring historical exception? Do they just shrug and say, well, I guess gold is fine sometimes?
They absolutely do not shrug. In fact, this single nose sparks a profound internal debate about the limits of legal precedent.
I love that a nose started a legal battle.
It really did. The text shows the scholar Muhammad looking at the Arfaja story and drawing a broad conclusion. He says essentially, this proves there is no harm in using gold for medical necessities. If Arfaja can have an entire nose made of gold, then a man can certainly use gold wire to bind his loose teeth together.
That seems like a very reasonable extrapolation. If you can rebuild a face with gold, you can fix a molar with gold. The precedent is established.
But Abu Hanifa steps in and vehemently disagrees. He takes a much stricter, incredibly narrow interpretation of the event.
What's his argument?
He argues that the baseline, unbreakable rule is that gold is haram for men. The exception granted to Arfaja was a hyper-specific one-off emergency measure because the permissible material, the silver, had explicitly failed and caused active harm, specifically in the unique environment of the nasal cavity.
So the environment of the nose is what matters.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Abu Hanifa argues that this does not give you blanket permission to start using gold for other medical issues if silver still works. He points out that you can successfully bind loose teeth with silver wire. Silver works perfectly fine in the mouth. It doesn't cause the same rotting issue as a solid block of silver used as a nose.
So because silver works, the necessity for gold does not actually exist for teeth.
Precisely.
Abu Hanifa is putting up a massive roadblock on the slippery slope. He is saying, do not use this one desperate, ancient medical emergency as an excuse to start putting flashy gold grills in your mouth.
He is terrified of people inching their way back into extravagance by claiming vague medical needs.
The exception must be walled off and limited exactly to the precise dimensions of the necessity.
The jurisprudential logic is incredibly tight. The necessity is addressed by the lowest permissible intervention. If a permitted material solves the problem, you use it. You only escalate to the forbidden material when the permitted material catastrophically fails.
It is a brilliant way to maintain the integrity of the law while still acknowledging that sometimes a guy just really needs a gold nose.
Yes.
Before we move on from the topic of what people wear on their bodies, I have to point out my favorite, tiny, incredibly humanizing detail hidden in the text.
Oh, I think I know the one.
Amidst all these heavy debates about gold, silver, and war silk, the text calmly states, "There is no harm in a man tying a thread on his finger or his ring for a need." They had a specific word for it, rathem. And the legal justification the jurists provide is that tying this string has a sound purpose, which is remembering when forgetting.
It is a sudden, charming flash of universal humanity.
It proves that human memory has always been completely unreliable. Hundreds of years ago, men were walking around the ancient markets with little strings tied around their fingers to remember to buy milk or run an errand.
Just trying to remember their grocery list.
Exactly. And the legal scholars actually had to sit down and formally rule, yes, this looks a bit silly. It might technically look like you are wearing unauthorized bizarre jewelry, but because its internal purpose is pure utility and not vanity, it is legally permitted. I absolutely love that they had to legislate the string.
It perfectly encapsulates the overarching theme here. Intent governs the material world. A silver ring is permitted if the intent is to seal documents. A silk border is permitted if the intent is durability. A gold nose is permitted if the intent is medical survival. A string is permitted if the intent is to manage a bad memory.
The invisible world of human intent constantly rewrites the rules of the physical world.
Beautifully put.
And speaking of the invisible world governing the physical world, that concept leads us directly into a highly sensitive, deeply complex area of the law, the boundaries of the gaze.
Yes, ara.
Because just as clothing is regulated by intent, who is allowed to look at whom and under what circumstances is heavily regulated. The text outlines an intricate framework for privacy, bodily autonomy, and medical ethics that feels surprisingly sophisticated for its time.
The foundational concept here is ara, which refers to the specific parts of the human body that must be covered and protected from the gaze of others. The baseline rules the text establishes are quite rigid.
What are the baselines?
For a man looking at a woman to whom he is not related, the permitted gaze is strictly restricted to the face and the hands. For a man looking at another man, the gaze is restricted from looking at the area between the navel and the knee.
Those are the static, default walls of privacy. But as we have seen with every other rule in this text, you cannot run a functional society if those walls are completely impenetrable. Reality demands exceptions. The text spends an enormous amount of time carving out highly controlled doorways in those walls, and every single doorway is built on the concept of necessity. Let's examine the three primary domains of necessity they outline: commerce, medicine, and justice.
Let's start with commerce.
In the domain of commerce, the text explains why the face and hands of a woman are excluded from the strict covering requirement. Why are those parts visible?
The text explicitly anchors this exception in economic reality. It states it is due to her need to transact with men in taking, giving, and other than that. It is an acknowledgement that women were active, necessary participants in the marketplace.
You cannot effectively negotiate, buy, sell, or legally identify a trading partner if their identity is entirely obscured.
Exactly. The law bends to accommodate the absolute economic necessity of women participating in public commerce.
The necessity of the market opens the door. What about the realm of medicine? This section reads almost like a primitive draft of modern medical ethics and patient privacy laws.
The rules governing medical treatment are intensely strict. The text states that a male doctor is permitted to look at a female patient for the purpose of treatment, but it strongly advises that, whenever physically possible, a woman should be trained and utilized to treat her. Because, as the text puts it, the gaze of one sex to its own sex is easier.
It prefers a same-sex practitioner to maximize comfort and maintain the baseline privacy walls.
Right.
But if a female doctor isn't available and a male doctor must intervene, how does the law manage that boundary?
It employs the exact same logic Abu Hanifa used with the gold nose. The doctor is only permitted to look at the exact specific site of the illness.
Only the site of the illness.
The text mandates that every other part of the patient's body must be completely covered, and the doctor must actively lower his gaze as much as physically possible while still performing the treatment. The jurists summarize this with a brilliant legal axiom: because what is established by necessity is restricted to its measure.
What is established by necessity is restricted to its measure. That is such a powerful governing principle. The exception does not destroy the rule.
No, it just modifies it.
The medical emergency does not blow the doors off the hinges. It opens a tiny, highly controlled aperture that is exactly as wide as the medical need dictates, and not a single millimeter wider.
It's the ultimate expression of the surgeon's scalpel approach to law.
And finally, we have the justice exception. This applies to judges passing rulings and witnesses providing testimony. The text permits them to look at the face of the person in question. The necessity here is what they call the revival of people's rights.
You cannot have a blind justice system.
Right. A witness must be able to definitively identify the person they are testifying against to prevent fraud and protect the innocent.
But this is where the text adds a massive, purely psychological caveat that completely changes how we understand this legal system.
Yeah, this part is wild.
It says that while the judge or witness is physically permitted to look, they must actively monitor their own mind. They must intend to fulfill justice, and they must actively guard against the ugly intention.
This brings up a phrase that is repeated constantly throughout this section. The text will say, an action is forbidden if one fears desire, or permitted only if you feel safe from desire. Does this ancient legal framework actually attempt to police the internal, invisible feelings of a human being?
This is arguably the most sophisticated and perhaps the most exhausting aspect of Hanafi jurisprudence. The physical boundary of the law, what you can touch, what you can see, is static. But the moral and legal boundary is highly dynamic. It shifts, expands, or contracts based entirely on the individual's internal psychological state.
How is that practically applied in a real-world scenario?
The text provides a fascinating example regarding physical touch, specifically the act of shaking hands. It notes a strict prophetic tradition stating that touching the hand of a woman who is not your immediate relative is forbidden. But then, the jurists immediately introduce a psychological exception. They rule that if the woman is elderly, to the point where she is not desired, there is absolutely no harm in a man shaking her hand or greeting her physically.
Because the underlying reason the prohibition existed in the first place, the fear of temptation or inappropriate escalation has organically evaporated due to age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The text even cites historical precedent, pointing out that the first caliph, Abu Bakr, used to visit tribes where he had ties and would shake the hands of the elderly women there.
Wow.
Think about what this means legally. The physical act is identical, two hands touching. But the legal ruling flips completely from forbidden to permitted, based entirely on the absence of the fear of temptation.
The law is forcing the individual to act as their own internal judge. It trusts the believer to ruthlessly evaluate their own heart. If you fear desire, even a legally permitted gaze becomes a sin. If the fear is genuinely absent, a strict physical boundary might be relaxed.
It is regulating the ecosystem of the heart, not just the movement of the limbs.
The law requires you to be hyper-aware of your own intentions at all times, which makes immense theological sense, but sounds incredibly exhausting to live with day to day.
Oh, for sure. It's a heavy burden.
And these complex, shifting boundaries regarding strangers in the public square become overwhelmingly intricate when we apply them inside the private walls of the home. This brings us to a challenging but essential part of the text, the ethics of the household.
To understand this section, we have to confront the historical reality of the era directly. A significant portion of this jurisprudential text is dedicated to managing the institution of slavery, which was a deeply entrenched economic and social reality in the ancient world.
It was everywhere.
Yes. The rules governing the household are heavily concerned with establishing legal and ethical boundaries around enslaved people.
While the modern mind recoils at the institution itself, our goal here is to understand the structural logic of the jurists. How did these scholars attempt to bring rigid legal order, biological safety, and ethical restraint to an institution that is fundamentally defined by massive power imbalances?
The primary legal mechanism they deployed to control this environment is a concept called istibra.
Let's define that clearly. What exactly is istibra?
It translates roughly to seeking clearance or imposing a mandatory waiting period. The text establishes a severe, unbreakable rule. If a man purchases a female slave or acquires ownership of her through any means, it is absolutely legally forbidden for him to be intimately involved with her, to touch her with desire, or even to kiss her until he has strictly observed this waiting period.
How long is the wait?
He must wait until she has had a full menstrual cycle, or if it is discovered she is pregnant, he must wait until she gives birth.
So a man legally purchases her in the market, he brings her into his household, but the law instantly slams down a mandatory pause button on any physical intimacy. What is the overarching fear driving this pause?
The text provides the explicit underlying logic, and it is entirely about biology and social order. It states the wisdom of the rule is seeking knowledge of the emptiness of the womb, safeguarding respected waters from mixing, and lineages from becoming confused.
Safeguarding respected waters. It is an obsessive focus on protecting absolute certainty regarding paternity.
In a tribal, patriarchal society, lineage is everything. Your lineage determines your social identity, your legal rights, your inheritance, and your economic survival. If the paternity of a child is mixed or confused, if no one knows whether the child belongs to the previous owner or the new owner, it creates a catastrophic legal and social crisis that can tear families apart.
The law imposes istibra as an impenetrable biological firewall. Before a new owner can introduce his lineage into the equation, the law demands absolute, undeniable biological proof that the woman is not already carrying the child of another man.
And the text is relentless about the triggers for this firewall. It applies whether you bought her, inherited her, or received her as a gift. The moment the legal deed transfers, the biological pause button is hit.
It is a striking example of the law intervening to violently suppress immediate human impulses for the sake of long-term, multi-generational social stability. But the logic of household boundaries gets even more intricate, almost mathematical, when we look at the two sisters rule.
This rule is fascinating.
This was the ruling that fascinated me the most because it operates exactly like a legal circuit breaker tripping in a house.
This ruling is a masterful demonstration of how heavily intent is weighed in this legal system and how the law creates massive deterrents to enforce boundaries. The baseline rule, which comes directly from Quranic law, is that a man is forbidden from being married to two sisters at the same time.
That makes sense.
The Hanafi jurists naturally extend this structural boundary to the context of enslaved women. A man cannot be intimately involved with two enslaved sisters simultaneously.
Okay, the rule is straightforward. You have two sisters in the household, you have to make a choice. You can only be intimate with one. But the text explores the messy reality. What happens when a man's impulses cause him to violate the boundaries of that choice?
Let's construct a legal hypothetical the text uses. A man owns two sisters. He has chosen to be intimate with Sister A. Sister B is strictly off limits. But suppose, in a moment of weakness or shifting desire, he crosses the room and he kisses Sister B with desire. Or he touches her with desire.
Just a kiss. He doesn't go any further.
Just a kiss. The text lays out the immediate, devastating legal consequence. The moment his lips touch the second sister with desire, he is instantly legally barred from being intimate with either of them. The circuit breaker trips, and the power is cut to the entire system.
Both of them become totally off limits instantly.
Absolutely. The logic is a closed loop. He can no longer touch the second sister because she is the sister of his original established partner. And he can no longer touch his original partner because he is now legally engaged in an act of intimacy with her sister. He has created an impossible paradox.
Wow.
The text states he's now strictly forbidden from both of them until he transfers the ownership of the other's private part to someone else by ownership or marriage, or frees her.
He literally has to sell one of the sisters, marry her off to another man, or grant her freedom just to restore his legal right to be with the other one. That is a massive, permanent structural consequence for a single kiss. Why does a mere kiss trigger the ultimate penalty?
Because in this specific jurisprudential framework, as the text explicitly states, The motives to intercourse are like intercourse and prohibition.
The motives are like the act. The intent carries the exact same legal weight as the completion of the act.
When he kissed the second sister with desire, the law categorizes that not as a minor slip-up, but as the legal initiation of the full act. Therefore, in the eyes of the law, he has attempted to combine both sisters simultaneously, which triggers the absolute overriding prohibition.
It's like attempted robbery.
Think about it in modern legal terms regarding attempted crimes, exactly. Attempted robbery carries severe penalties because the intent to break the boundary was fully formed, even if the vault wasn't opened. The Hanafis are using this logic to create a massive psychological deterrent.
It's brilliant.
If you blur the lines of the household even slightly, if you indulge a wandering eye, you don't just get a slap on the wrist, you lose access to everything until you permanently structurally resolve the conflict you created. It forces absolute unyielding clarity in how boundaries are maintained.
The systemic logic is just brilliant. It uses the threat of total loss to enforce discipline. And this relentless drive to manage boundaries, mitigate harm, and weigh intent doesn't just apply to the bedroom. It scales up beautifully to how they manage the entire city. The way the law governs the microethics of the household is exactly how it governs the macroeconomics of the society.
We are moving from the ancient bedroom to the ancient boardroom.
Let's look at how they handled the free market.
The economic rulings in this text are incredibly robust, dealing directly with the dark side of commerce. Let's start with the most destructive market force, monopolies, or hoarding, which the Arabic text refers to as idikar.
The moral baseline the text establishes is very clear. It cites a prophetic tradition stating the importer is provided for and the monopolist is cursed. Hoarding essential goods to artificially drive up prices is treated as a major moral crime. The text says the monopolist invalidates the right of the common people and violently constricts their ability to live.
But true to form, the Hanafi jurists do not just issue a blanket moral condemnation and walk away. They sit down and debate the exact mechanical geography of the harm. They ask, where exactly does hoarding become a punishable crime?
The geography of harm is a great way to frame it. The text provides 3 distinct geographic scenarios. First, it says if you hoard food in a small, isolated town, it immediately harms the people. The supply shock is instant, the prices spike, and people go hungry that very day. In that specific geography, hoarding is absolute haram, forbidden.
But then they look at the opposite extreme. What if a merchant hoards grain in a massive, sprawling metropolis like Baghdad at its height? Abu Hanifa argues that in a giant city with countless supply lines, one merchant holding back his grain doesn't actually dent the overall market supply. The prices don't spike. Nobody starves. Therefore, Abu Hanifa rules, because the effect of the crime hasn't occurred, the action is not legally classified as a forbidden monopoly. It is a strictly effects-based law. If there is no tangible harm to the public, there is no crime.
And there is a third scenario that I found fascinating regarding private property. What if I am a massive agribusiness? What if I own a huge private farm and I decide to hoard the entire yield of my own estate?
The text addresses this explicitly. It rules that whoever hoards the yield of his own private estate is not legally a monopolist. The reasoning is that the grain is his pure private right, created by his own labor and land, and the right of the public has not yet attached itself to that specific grain. The public only has a right to what is actively brought into the city center for communal trade.
It is a remarkable defense of private property rights, even when it brushes up against public need. Although Abu Yusuf, Abu Hanifa's student, pushes back hard on this whole framework, doesn't he?
Abu Yusuf was much more aggressive in his market regulations. He argued that anything that harms the public, whether it is food, gold, clothing, or building materials, constitutes a forbidden monopoly. He expands the definition away from just grain in a small town to a much broader, dynamic understanding of market forces and public vulnerability.
Okay, if the scholars are divided on hoarding, how do they handle the government stepping in to fix the mess? What are the rules on tasir, or state-mandated price fixing?
The default position of the text is fiercely anti-price fixing. The free market is viewed with almost theological reverence. The text cites a tradition where the prophet was begged to set prices during inflation, and he refused, stating, God is the one who fixes prices, the withholder, the expander, the provider.
They really trusted the market.
The general belief is that the natural fluctuation of price is an expression of divine will and market reality. The price belongs to the merchant, and the ruler, the imam, has no business interfering in a private contract.
But this is Hanafi law. There is always an exception when reality gets too grim.
Exactly. The text states the ruler must keep his hands off the market unless the merchants are actively colluding to extort the public. If the sellers are acting oppressively, forming cartels, and the judge cannot protect the basic survival rights of the Muslims any other way, then the state is permitted to violently intervene and fix prices.
Public welfare overrides the market.
The ultimate principle is that public welfare and survival will always override free market ideals when the market becomes a weapon against the vulnerable.
This brings me to what is, without a doubt, my absolute favorite economic debate in the entire text. It deals with corporate responsibility, aiding in a sin, and what I call severed liability. To understand how relevant this is, let me give the modern analogy first.
Oh, please do.
Today, we are constantly engaged in massive societal debates about the moral liability of infrastructure providers. If a massive tech company like AWS rents server space to a sketchy, illegal, or hateful website, is AWS morally and legally responsible for the harm that website causes?
Right.
Or if a major global bank provides standard loans to a front company that they strongly suspect is run by a cartel, does the bank share the guilt for the cartel's violence?
We are asking where the chain of moral complicity ends. And the ancient jurists used incredibly similar hypotheticals to test this exact boundary.
The text starts with an easy one. It says, unequivocally, you cannot sell weapons to a known rebel during a time of civil war, a fitna. You cannot sell swords to people actively trying to burn down the city.
The logic there is simple. A weapon sold into a riot has only one primary immediate purpose: violence. The transaction is directly and inextricably supplying the sin.
Right. But then the text introduces two much trickier scenarios.
Yeah.
Suppose I am a wealthy landlord and I rent a physical house to a man who turns around and uses that building to run an illegal tavern selling forbidden alcohol.
Okay. Or suppose I'm a simple farmer and I sell a massive barrel of pure grape juice to a guy I absolutely know makes his living as a winemaker. According to the strict interpretation of Abu Hanifa, are those transactions legal? Abu Hanifa's ruling here is a controversial cornerstone of transactional law. He rules that both transactions, renting the house and selling the juice, are perfectly legally permissible.
How is that logically possible? How is selling juice to a known winemaker not directly aiding in the sin of alcohol production?
Abu Hanifa argues for the concept of severed liability by isolating the specific nature of the transaction. He says, look closely at what is actually being exchanged. When you rent a house, you are exchanging money for the benefit of a physical architectural structure. The building itself is morally neutral. There is no sin in bricks and wood.
Okay, what about the juice?
When you sell grape juice, you are selling a permitted, wholesome, completely halal beverage. The juice is just juice.
But I know what he was going to do with it. I know he's going to ferment it.
And Abu Hanifa replies, that is his independent choice. The sin does not exist inherently in the juice. The sin only comes into existence later, through the active, independent, free will choice of the winemaker to ferment it. The sin is in the drinking of the patron at the tavern.
That's fascinating.
Abu Hanifa argues that because the buyer is a free agent, a human being with independent agency, their subsequent choice to act immorally severs your liability. You provided a neutral good, they chose to corrupt it. Therefore, your original transaction remains clean.
It is the ultimate, I just sell the servers, I don't control the website's defense. It is astonishing to see this exact corporate defense articulated centuries ago.
And it was just as controversial then as it is now. The text prominently notes that Abu Hanifa's own top students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, vehemently rejected his ruling. They declared that selling juice to a winemaker is absolutely makruh, it is disliked and forbidden because it is direct assistance in sin.
They didn't buy the severed liability argument.
They refused the hyper-literal severed liability argument. They took a much more holistic moral ecosystem view. They argued that if you knowingly supply the raw materials that allow a vice to flourish, you are part of the supply chain of sin, and you share in the moral taint. It is a profound, unresolved debate over the limits of individual liberty versus corporate and societal responsibility.
It is incredible how these ancient debates mirror our modern anxieties perfectly. And as we move into the final section of our deep dive, we get to see how all these rigid rules, these intense economic debates, and these social firewalls actually bend and adapt when the society itself changes. The law is not frozen in amber. It has to react to shifting demographics, new technologies, and interfaith realities.
The ability of the law to evolve is what keeps it alive. A beautiful, highly illustrative example in the text is the discussion surrounding dotting the Quran.
Let's explain what that means for listeners who might not be familiar with the history of the Arabic script.
The earliest written copies of the Quran were recorded in a very bare skeletal form of Arabic script. It did not have the dots and vowel markers, the diacritical marks that modern Arabic uses to distinguish between certain letters and sounds. The text notes that originally, adding any dots, red marks, or chapter indicators to the Quran was considered makruh, strongly disliked.
Why would they dislike making the text easier to read?
Because the early scholars wanted to strip the Quran bare. They were fiercely protective of the text's purity. They wanted it to remain exactly as it was physically written during the Prophet's time, without any human additions, embellishments, or crutches. The oral tradition of memorization was supposed to guide the reading of the bare script.
But the reality of the empire changed drastically.
Exactly. As the Islamic Empire rapidly expanded outward from the Arabian Peninsula, massive populations of non-Arabs, Persians, Byzantines, North Africans began converting. These new Muslims did not have the intuitive native grasp of the Arabic language required to read the bare script correctly. They were starting to mispronounce the sacred text, which was a theological disaster.
So the jurists had to adapt. The text explains that what was once disliked eventually became viewed as good and beautiful. The ruling shifted because, as the text explicitly states, in our time, there is a necessity for the non-Arabs to have markers.
The necessity of preserving the meaning of the text overrode the tradition of preserving the look of the text. The law evolved because the utility demanded it.
And we see a similar, deeply pragmatic evolution when it comes to interfaith relations. The text addresses how Muslims living in these diverse cities should interact with their Jewish and Christian neighbors.
It doesn't just tolerate interaction. It explicitly encourages neighborly compassion. The text states that visiting a sick Jewish or Christian neighbor is considered a type of piety towards them. It justifies this by citing historical precedent of the Prophet himself visiting a Jewish neighbor who had fallen ill. It demonstrates that the fundamental social fabric of the neighborhood, the basic human duty of compassion, supersedes theological boundaries.
The text pushes that boundary even further when it discusses sacred spaces. There is a fascinating debate recorded in the text about whether non-Muslims are legally permitted to enter the sacred mosque in Mecca.
This is a classic clash of literal versus conceptual interpretation. The text notes that Imam Shafi argued vehemently that non-Muslims cannot enter, and he cited a specific Quranic verse that states, "The polytheists are impure, so let them not approach the sacred mosque." Shafi takes the word impure entirely literally. He views it as a physical state of contagion that would physically dirty the sacred floor.
But the Hanafi scholars look at the exact same verse and come to the opposite conclusion.
The Hanafis permit entry. To justify this, they cite historical reports of the Prophet hosting a delegation from the city of Ta'if who had not yet converted inside his own mosque, even setting up a tent for them.
So precedent matters.
But their jurisprudential argument is what's truly profound. They argue that the impurity mentioned in the Quranic verse is a spiritual state. The impurity of their theological belief, it is not a physical, biological dirtiness. Because the impurity is spiritual, their physical presence does not pollute the physical space of the mosque. It is a remarkably inclusive, expansive interpretation of a verse that sounds on its face incredibly restrictive.
They redefine the boundary from a physical wall to a spiritual concept, which allows for diplomatic and social interaction inside the most sacred space.
Exactly.
Okay, before we wrap up this massive journey, I have to ask about one final, seemingly random ruling that caught me completely off guard. Amidst all these profound, high-level debates about theology, economics, and medical ethics, the text suddenly drops a harsh, uncompromising ban on board games. It explicitly singles out chess, backgammon, and a game called 14. Why the intense, specific hatred for chess? Half the world today thinks chess is a hallmark of intellectual refinement.
The jurists were fully aware of that argument. The text openly acknowledges that some people, including the great scholar al-Shafi'i, believed playing chess was permissible because it sharpens the minds and stimulates the intellects. They understood it was a game of strategy, not just mindless luck.
But the Hanafis still ban it. Why?
If there is any money wagered on the game, it instantly becomes gambling, which is strictly, universally forbidden. But the Hanafis ban it even if no money is involved. They categorize it as a forbidden amusement because, as the text states, it is a type of play that diverts from the remembrance of God and from the Friday and congregational prayers.
It isn't a ban on the pieces, it's a ban on the time it consumes. It is about the economy of time.
Exactly. The text quotes a sweeping tradition. Whatever diverts you from the remembrance of God is a game of chance. The scholars viewed human time and attention as a sacred, finite resource. Getting sucked into a deeply complex 4-hour chess match, which, as any chess player knows, is incredibly easy to do, was viewed as a dangerous, consuming distraction from one's spiritual duties, family obligations, and societal responsibilities.
It is an ancient warning against the attention economy.
It really is. They recognize that human attention is fragile. It is easily captured, hypnotized, and drained by complex, absorbing systems. They were legislating against the loss of focus.
They were worried about screen time centuries before the first screen was ever invented. A 4-hour chess match was the 8th century version of doom scrolling.
That's a great way to put it.
We have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. We started by exploring the ban on gold and silver plates, and how a hyperliteral loophole about a silver-plated rim reveals a strict mechanical view of the law. We walked into the Kufa marketplace and saw how the burden of proof is drastically lowered to allow society to buy bread, while remaining terrifyingly high when the purity of religion is at stake.
We agonized over the social pressure of the dinner party, learning the heavy psychological truth that a leader's mere presence in a room acts as an implicit endorsement of the sins occurring there.
We looked at the strange threads of intent, how silk becomes permissible tactical gear in a war zone, how a rotting silver nose can be upgraded to gold purely through the narrow doorway of medical necessity, and how a simple string tied around a finger proves that human memory has always been terrible.
We examine the complex boundaries of the gaze, seeing how the undeniable necessities of commerce, medicine, and justice open small, highly controlled apertures in the walls of privacy, and how the law attempts to police the internal, shifting fear of temptation.
We waded into the heavy ethics of the ancient household, unpacking the biological firewall of the waiting period, and analyzing that incredible circuit breaker rule where a single kiss of desire legally counts as the full act, permanently severing a man's rights.
We debated macroeconomics, from the geography of hoarding to the reluctance of the state to fix prices, and we explored the profound, highly modern debate over severed liability when a landlord rents a house to a tavern.
And finally, we saw the law actively evolve to survive. We saw them add dots to the sacred text to accommodate a changing empire, redefine impurity to allow neighbors into the mosque, and ban the intellectual allure of chess to protect the sacred economy of human attention. When you step back and look at this entire, massive jurisprudential structure, the overarching theme is relentless. It is a relentless, centuries-long attempt to balance the absolute, crystalline, perfect ideal of divine law with the undeniably messy biological and economic reality of human necessity.
It's a legal system that possesses the profound wisdom to recognize that if a law cannot bend to accommodate a severed nose, or a forgetful mind needing a string, or a complex city needing to buy its daily bread, that law will ultimately shatter.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. Today, we live in a modern world where we increasingly rely on algorithms, zero-tolerance policies, and automated tech systems to govern our lives, manage our transactions, and even police our speech on social media.
Right, it's all automated now.
These modern systems are incredibly fast, and they are mathematically precise. But they are often completely, brutally rigid. They do not understand the messy reality of context. A content moderation algorithm doesn't know the difference between a nuanced historical discussion of a bad word and someone actually weaponizing that word as a slur. It just sees the violation of the code and it swings the ban hammer instantly.
Exactly.
But looking back at this centuries-old Islamic jurisprudence, we see a legal operating system that explicitly, painstakingly baked concepts like human necessity, avoidance of severe hardship, and internal intent directly into its highest, most sacred laws. It required human judges to stop, look at the messy, specific context of a silver cup or an older woman's hand or a winemaker's barrel of juice, and apply the law with a surgeon's scalpel rather than a sledgehammer.
The human element is required.
Yeah. So here is the question. In our desperate modern rush to build perfect, automated, frictionless systems to govern our society, have we forgotten the legal and moral genius of intentionally making room for human frailty? Are our multi-billion-dollar algorithms actually far less sophisticated than an 8th century jurist trying to figure out if a man with a rotting silver nose is allowed to use a piece of gold? Thank you for joining us on this massive deep dive. I encourage you to look at the rigid rules governing your own life today. The corporate terms of service you blindly click accept on, the automated policies at your workplace, the zero-tolerance rules in your community, and ask yourself, where is the room for necessity? Where's the measure of human intent? Until next time, keep questioning the hidden logic of the world around you.